Before we dive in, make sure you hit subscribe and turn on notifications. This is where history comes alive in ways you've never seen before. Don't just watch, be part of the revolution with us. The night air clung heavy with winter's bite, and Boston lay restless under the weight of a distant empire's rule. Lanterns flickered on narrow cobbled streets, casting long shadows that seemed to whisper of rebellion. No one dared to speak it too loudly. But the truth burned in every tavern, every marketplace, every gathering of colonists. The crown was squeezing them dry, and the noose was tightening. The East India Company's ships loomed like ghosts in the harbor, their hulls heavy with crates of tea, a cargo that was more than just a drink. To the men and women of Boston, it was the bitter symbol of submission, of chains forged thousands of miles away. In a modest wooden tavern on Milk Street, Samuel Adams leaned forward over the rough-hewn table. His eyes, sharp with determination, flickered in the dim light. Around him, the Sons of Liberty gathered, their voices low, their breath steaming in the cold. These were not soldiers, not men bred for war. They were merchants, craftsmen, fathers, sons, but anger had carved steel into their spines. "Brothers," Adams whispered, "the time for words is near its end. The king believes he can choke us with his taxes, drown us in his tea, and leave us bowing in gratitude. He underestimates us." A murmur of agreement rippled through the room. John Hancock, ever the firebrand, slammed his fist against the table. "If we let them unload those ships, then we have bent the knee. Make no mistake, the moment those chests touch the soil, Britain wins." A silence followed, thick and suffocating. Each man knew what was being said without being spoken. Defiance meant danger. Defiance meant treason. Defiance meant war. Across town, in the governor's mansion, another fire burned, this one in the hearth of power. Governor Thomas Hutchinson sat rigid, his powdered wig pristine, his jaw tight as stone. To him, the colonists were spoiled children, ungrateful and unruly. "The tea will be landed," he declared to his council. "Boston will obey or Boston will pay." But in the streets, whispers turned into chants. Children mimicked their fathers' words. Women gathered in kitchens, vowing to stand with their men. Ordinary people, tired of being silenced, were finding their voices. The harbor waited like a stage before its curtain rise, the ships groaning softly against the tide. None yet knew how quickly the world would change, how a single night could ignite a revolution that would thunder across centuries. Boston did not sleep that night. It dreamed. It plotted. And beneath the pale December moon, the shadows of defiance grew long. The Green Dragon Tavern was alive with unease that December evening, its wooden beams creaking under the press of anxious bodies. Tankards clinked. Boots shuffled on the sawdust-covered floor. But laughter was scarce. A storm was building in Boston, not of wind or rain, but of fury. Samuel Adams stood at the center of it all, his voice steady but charged with urgency. "The ships remain," he declared, his hand sweeping toward the harbor as if he could drag the vessels into the room. "The deadline passes, yet the governor refuses to relent. The tea must not land, this we swore." Faces turned toward him, hardened sailors with salt still crusting their clothes, artisans with calloused hands, young men whose eyes betrayed both fear and fire. They were not united by power or wealth, but by grievance, a shared wound carved by Parliament's hand. From the corner, a wiry man rose, his voice hoarse from smoke and drink. "Samuel, speak plain. We're tired of petitions. We're tired of waiting. Do we act or do we kneel?" The words struck like a match in dry tinder. Murmurs swelled, boots stamped, and someone pounded the table so hard the tankards rattled. The tavern breathed as one body, restless, aching to move. John Hancock's face flushed crimson, his temper as quick as ever. "If we cower now, then we deserve the chains they place upon us. Enough. Let Boston show its teeth." But even as bold words filled the smoky air, fear slithered in the silence between them. Every man present knew the cost of open defiance. The gallows stood ready for traitors. The king's wrath was merciless. Yet so too was the weight of surrender. Outside, the streets hummed with the cold breath of December. Women huddled in shawls, whispering of their husbands, and sons gathered in the tavern. Children peeked through frosted windows, catching only glimpses of stern faces and clenched fists. Hope and terror mingled in every corner of the town. Inside, Adams's voice cut through the din, sharp as steel. "Mark my words, history will not remember us kindly if we falter. Tonight the decision is not whether to drink tea or not. It is whether we are free men or subjects." The room fell silent, as if the very timbers of the tavern held its breath. Then a single voice called out from the back, "To the harbor!" The words rippled, then roared until the tavern shook with it. To the harbor! Men surged to their feet, their faces set, their hearts pounding with the knowledge that there was no turning back. That night, under the veil of shadows, Boston's destiny shifted. The spark had been struck and fire was on its way. The December wind howled through Boston's narrow alleys, carrying with it the scent of salt and wood smoke. Lanterns flickered in doorways as men moved swiftly and quietly, their boots crunching over frost-hardened earth. They carried no banners, no flags, only determination, and the heavy knowledge that the world might never be the same after this night. Inside a dim workshop, rough cloth and soot were hastily applied. Feathers from old headdresses were tied into hair. Streaks of paint smeared across pale faces. The Sons of Liberty had chosen their disguise, Mohawk warriors, not to mock but to mask. If the crown demanded to know who had defied it, the answer would be hidden behind shadows and symbols. Samuel Adams adjusted the rough shawl draped over his shoulders. His heart pounded not from fear alone, but from the weight of what was about to unfold. "Let them not call us cowards," he murmured, his voice low. "If they see us as savages, so be it. But let history know we acted as free men." Around him, men nodded, their hands shaking as they tied knots, as they darkened their skin with ash. Some were fathers with children asleep at home. Others were boys barely grown into manhood, their eyes bright with reckless courage. They laughed nervously, trying to mask the terror that gnawed inside their chests. Outside, the harbor loomed like a dark giant. The ships, Dartmouth, Eleanor, Beaver, sat heavy in the water, their holds stuffed with the king's tea. Each creak of timber, each slap of waves against the hulls sounded like a drumbeat of fate. A boy no older than 15 tugged at the sleeve of a man beside him. "Do you think they'll hang us if they catch us?" His voice trembled, barely a whisper. The man bent low, gripping his shoulder firmly. "If they do, lad, then let it be known we hung as men, not slaves." Torches lit the path as the disguised rebels gathered in clusters. The town, though silent, was not asleep. From behind shutters and in candle-lit windows, families watched with breath held tight. Mothers pulled children close, whispering prayers into their hair. Every soul in Boston knew what was at stake. As the group marched toward the harbor, the air felt heavier, charged, as though even the earth itself understood the weight of the moment. No one laughed now. No one trembled. A cry rose into the night, sharp and unyielding, "Boston Harbor shall be our answer." And with that the men moved as one into the darkness, into destiny and into the pages of history. The harbor was a mirror of black glass, its stillness broken only by the groan of ships and the icy slap of water against their hulls. Moonlight spilled across the waves, silver and cold, illuminating the silent procession of men approaching the docks. Their disguises, rough feathers, soot-streaked faces, and coarse blankets shrouded them in mystery. Yet no mask could hide the pounding of their hearts, each beat louder than the last. Every step closer to the ships was a step further from safety, a step deeper into defiance. The creak of the wharf beneath their boots echoed like gunshots in the night. Men tightened their fists around hatchets and staves, their breath steaming in the winter air. The ships loomed before them now, their masts stretching into the sky like the gallows awaiting traitors. At the forefront, a voice rang low but steady. Remember, no blood, no theft, no destruction but the tea. It was not chaos they sought, but a message that liberty could not be bought nor taxed into silence. They climbed swiftly, shadows slipping over the sides of the Dartmouth. The smell of tar, salt, and tea filled their lungs. The deck groaned beneath their weight. Sailors stirred, but no blade was drawn. Some crew members stood frozen, their eyes wide, knowing better than to challenge the tide of fury descending upon them. "Stand aside," one rebel growled, his face streaked in ash. "We come only for the cargo." In the town, watchers huddled on rooftops and piers, straining their eyes through the moonlight. Mothers clutched children who whispered, "What are they doing, Mama?" To which the only answer was a trembling hush. They were watching the moment history split wide open. Then came the first thud, a chest smashed open under the swing of a hatchet, its contents spilling like dark earth across the deck. The scent of raw tea rose thick in the night, mingling with the salt air. A second chest followed, then a third, until the rhythm of destruction became a thunderous drumbeat of rebellion. With shouts and grunts, men heaved the heavy crates overboard. The harbor roared with splashes as the tea struck the water. Bursting open like wounded soldiers, waves of leaves spread across the surface, staining the sea itself with defiance. Hours passed, chest after chest hurled into the depths. By the time dawn threatened the horizon, over 300 had sunk beneath the harbor's skin. The men stood breathless on the decks, sweat freezing to their brows despite the cold. They had not drawn blood, yet they had wounded an empire, and as they slipped back into the shadows, Boston held its breath, knowing nothing would ever be the same. By morning, the harbor no longer glittered like glass, it festered with defiance. The waters, once calm and black, now writhed with floating leaves of tea, spreading in dark swirls that stained the tide. From the wharves, townsfolk gathered, staring at the strange sight. An ocean transformed into a giant teacup of rebellion. Children scrambled onto barrels for a better view, pointing at the wreckage with wide eyes. Women stood silent, their shawls pulled tight, whispering prayers as though afraid God himself might smite the city for its boldness. Some men smiled grimly, pride etched into their weathered faces. Others only shook their heads, knowing the crown's fury would not be slow in coming. In the taverns, the story spread like wildfire. 340 chests, one voice exclaimed, slamming a mug on the table. All of it, into the sea. The room erupted with disbelief and awe. Ordinary laborers who had gone to bed as subjects woke that morning as something different, witnesses to defiance that could never be undone. But in the governor's mansion, fury boiled hotter than the strongest brew. Thomas Hutchinson's face was a mask of rage as he struck the table with his fist. An outrage, he thundered to his council. An act of treason against the crown itself. They think themselves free men? We shall remind them of their place. Yet even as he raged, the people outside whispered a different truth. They spoke of bravery, of sacrifice, of men who risked the noose so their children might stand taller. To many, the tea chests sinking into the icy depths were not mere goods. Destroyed, they were chains shattered. Still, fear lingered in every alley. Families questioned what would come next. Would redcoats descend upon Boston with muskets blazing? Would gallows rise in the square? Even those who cheered the loudest could not escape the chill of uncertainty. A young boy crouched by the water's edge, dipping his hand into the bitter tide. He pulled it back, dripping with brown-stained foam. His father, standing behind him, murmured, "Remember this sight, son. You will tell your children of the morning Boston defied an empire." Across the ocean, word would soon sail on swift ships to England, where Parliament's halls would seethe with outrage. But here in Boston, the people walked with their heads higher, their steps steadier. For the first time, they felt the taste of freedom, not sweet, but bitter as the tea that stained their harbor. Boston had chosen defiance. Now it would have to bear the weight of consequence. Winter winds howled through Boston's crooked streets, carrying with them rumors darker than the night sky. Word of the harbor's rebellion had spread beyond the town's borders, galloping on horseback, whispered in taverns, and carried on the frozen lips of traders. The message was clear. Boston had defied its king. Inside the Green Dragon Tavern, men huddled close around the fire, their voices low, their faces tight with worry. The air still smelled faintly of smoke and spilled ale, but gone was the reckless laughter of rebellion. In its place, there lingered the heavy silence of waiting. "They'll come for us," muttered one man, staring into the flames. "Ships, soldiers. You'll see. The crown will not let this stand." John Hancock, ever brash, leaned forward with fire in his eyes. "Let them come. We are not children to be whipped into silence. This act will echo across the colonies. We will not stand alone." But Samuel Adams' face was graver. He knew what Hancock's pride refused to admit, that Boston was exposed, vulnerable and already a target painted bold red. "We must be ready," he said softly. "They will strike not with words but with punishment, and the people must decide if they will bend or break." Beyond the tavern walls, whispers fluttered like restless birds. Some called the Tea Party an act of courage, a strike for liberty itself. Others muttered that it was folly, a reckless provocation that would bring ruin upon every man, woman, and child in Boston. Fear walked the streets as freely as the people. In the governor's mansion, letters were penned with venom, sent across the ocean with haste. "Send soldiers. Seal their harbor. Strip them of trade until they crawl back in submission." Hutchinson's quill cut into the parchment as though it were the very throat of Boston. Meanwhile, in London, Parliament's chambers stirred with fury. The news of the Tea Party struck like lightning. To the lords and ministers, it was not merely destruction of property, it was humiliation. an empire mocked by its own subjects. They demanded punishment swift and merciless, punishment that would break Boston's spirit and serve as a warning to all the colonies. Back in the city, families clung to one another, torn between pride and dread. Mothers whispered to their children that freedom was worth the risk, though their trembling hands betrayed their fear. Fathers looked out over the harbor, wondering if tomorrow would bring sails not laden with tea, but with soldiers and cannons. The tea had sunk to the bottom of the sea, but its ripples had only just begun to spread, and soon, those ripples would become waves that no colony could escape. Across the Atlantic and the gilded halls of London, fury burned hotter than any hearth. The news of Boston's rebellion had landed like a cannonball in Parliament. Men in powdered wigs rose to their feet, voices raised in outrage. To them, the image of tea chests bobbing in Boston Harbor was more than theft. It was insult, humiliation, a dagger driven into the pride of empire. They must be taught a lesson, one minister thundered, his fist slamming the table. A colony that dares defy the crown must be crushed. King George III himself, stiff and unyielding, gave no room for mercy. His jaw set, his voice cold, he declared, "The town of Boston shall be punished until it bows. Let them taste the iron hand of empire." And thus Parliament set in motion the coercive acts. The colonists would name them the intolerable acts. Boston's harbor would be closed, strangling its lifeblood of trade. Town meetings would be shackled, its voice silenced. Soldiers would be quartered in homes, their red coats a constant reminder of subjugation. It was not justice, it was vengeance. When word of the acts reached Boston, the city reeled as though struck by musket fire. Merchants watched helplessly as ships sat idle, their goods rotting, their livelihoods slipping away. Fishermen stared at empty waters they could no longer freely use. Hunger crept through the streets, silent and merciless. Families were forced to open their doors to redcoats, soldiers who ate their bread and slept in their beds. The clash of boots on cobblestones became the heartbeat of the city, a reminder of who held power. Mothers pulled children close when soldiers passed, their eyes lowered, fear etched into every line of their faces. Yet beneath the weight of oppression, something unexpected stirred. Other colonies, hearing of Boston's plight, began to send aid, grain, livestock, and supplies trickled in from Virginia, Pennsylvania, and beyond. What was meant to isolate Boston instead bound the colonies closer together. In the taverns, whispers hardened into resolve. Samuel Adams, his face weary but unbroken, declared, "They believe they can starve us into submission. They are wrong. Every lash they strike against Boston binds us tighter as brothers." And in quiet moments, fathers told their children, "Remember this, remember how they tried to break us, for this is the fire that will forge a nation." The king had sought to crush rebellion. Instead, he had fanned its flames. The punishment meant to silence. Boston was awakening something greater, something neither Parliament nor empire could contain. Boston bled, but it did not bleed alone. The closing of its harbor had sent shockwaves through every colony. Carried on horseback, whispered at hearths, shouted in marketplaces. What had once been a city's struggle was fast becoming the cause of a continent. In Virginia, Patrick Henry rose in the House of Burgesses, his voice sharp as a blade. "An attack upon Boston is an attack upon us all," he declared, his words igniting sparks in the hearts of men who had never seen Boston's shores. In Pennsylvania, wagons loaded with grain began their long journey north. From the Carolinas came livestock, barrels of rice, and letters of solidarity. What the crown sought to isolate, it had bound together. In taverns from New York to Charleston, men raised mugs not in celebration but in solemn vow. "Boston stands for us, and we must stand for Boston." The rebellion was no longer a whisper. It was a chorus swelling across 13 colonies. But unity was not born easily. In dimly lit chambers, men debated with furrowed brows and restless hands. Some feared the might of Britain's armies and wished only for peace. Others demanded resistance, crying that liberty was worth any price. The arguments raged long into the night, yet through the clamor, one truth became clear. The colonies could no longer act as strangers. In September of 1774, delegates gathered in Philadelphia, their footsteps echoing through the halls of Carpenter's Hall. It was the first Continental Congress, farmers and lawyers, merchants and soldiers, men of every colony brought together by necessity. They came not as Virginians or New Yorkers or Bostonians, but as Americans. The air in the hall was thick with tension. Quills scratched across parchment, voices clashed, but a shared fire burned behind every word. They pledged to stand united, to boycott British goods, to resist the iron grip of Parliament. And though many still hoped for reconciliation, all knew the ground beneath them trembled with the weight of history. Back in Boston, weary eyes lifted with hope as supplies arrived from distant colonies. Bread was broken with gratitude. Prayers whispered for unseen friends hundreds of miles away. For the first time, the people of Boston understood. They were not fighting alone. In the governor's mansion, redcoats patrolled with muskets gleaming, their presence heavy as chains. Yet outside, in kitchens and taverns, in fields and meeting houses, a spirit grew strong enough to challenge an empire. The crown had tried to silence Boston. Instead, it had given birth to a voice loud enough to echo across 13 colonies, soon to thunder across the world. The winter of 1774 bled into spring, but the chill in Boston was no longer from the wind alone. The city lived under the shadow of bayonets, redcoats stationed at every corner, muskets gleaming, eyes cold and watchful. The clatter of boots on cobblestones echoed like the drums of war. Yet beneath that heavy silence, the colonies stirred with restless defiance. In Philadelphia, men wrote petitions, their quills scratching pleas for reconciliation. But in taverns, barns, and secret fields, another truth was whispered. Words alone would not free them. Muskets were cleaned, powder was hidden, militias drilled in the shadows. The air itself seemed to tremble with anticipation. In Boston, Samuel Adams moved like a hunted fox, always glancing over his shoulder. The crown wanted him silenced, his name struck from history. But his voice grew louder, his words sharper. They may take our livelihoods, but they will not take our liberty, he declared to gathered crowds. His speeches no longer called merely for defiance, they called for readiness. John Hancock, bold and unyielding, financed supplies for militias. Farmers who had once only wielded plows now carried muskets slung across their shoulders. Ordinary men, blacksmiths, shopkeepers, apprentices became soldiers in waiting. They were not polished armies but minutemen ready to fight at a moment's call. Across the countryside, fear and resolve walked hand in hand. Mothers wept quietly as they stitched uniforms knowing their sons might not return. Fathers taught their boys how to load powder and ball, passing down the knowledge not as tradition, but as survival. London answered not with compromise, but with more troops, more ships, more punishment. The empire tightened its grip, but with each squeeze, resistance grew harder, sharper. The colonies began to look at one another not as distant neighbors, but as brothers bound by the same chains. By the spring of 1775, the whispers had become shouts. War is coming, men muttered in marketplaces. War is coming, women confessed in hushed voices as they baked bread. Even children sensed it, their games shifting from play to mock battles, their sticks held like muskets. Everywhere eyes turned toward Boston, the city where it had begun, the city that refused to bend. And in that defiance, others found their courage. The road was narrowing now, leading not to reconciliation but to conflict. And as night fell over the colonies, a storm gathered on the horizon, thunder rolling closer with each passing hour. The revolution had not yet exploded, but its footsteps could already be heard in the silence before the first shot. Dawn crept over Lexington on April 19, 1775. The sky brushed with pale fire. The air was sharp, alive with the promise of spring, but also with the weight of destiny. On the village green, a small band of colonial militia stood trembling in the chill, muskets clutched tight, eyes darting toward the road where dust began to rise. The redcoats were coming. The sound of drums and boots thundered closer. An iron wave of British soldiers marching with precision, their bayonets glinting like 1,000 cruel stars. Against them stood farmers and blacksmiths, fathers and sons, ordinary men facing the might of an empire. Their coats were mismatched, their training scarce. Yet in their hearts burned the defiance that had begun in Boston's harbor. Captain John Parker, his voice hoarse with illness but steady with resolve, looked upon his men. "Stand your ground," he said softly. "Don't fire unless fired upon. But if they mean to have a war, let it begin here." Silence gripped the world in that moment. The soldiers advanced, the militia held their line, and all of history seemed to hold its breath. Then, a shot, no one knew from where, no one knew from whom, but it cracked the dawn like thunder splitting the heavens. Muskets roared, smoke filled the air, and chaos swallowed the green. Men fell, some dead, others clutching wounds. as screams mingled with the clash of steel. The first blood of revolution had been spilled. By the time the Redcoats pushed through Lexington and marched toward Concord, the countryside was awake with fury. Bells rang, drums pounded, and riders galloped through the night shouting the words that would echo forever. "The British are coming!" At Concord's North Bridge, militia gathered in greater numbers, their courage swelling as neighbors stood beside them. Smoke curled from the barrels of muskets as volleys cracked across the river. The British, stunned by the resistance, began to falter. Soldiers who had once sneered at the colonists now saw them not as rabble, but as warriors. By day's end, the Redcoats retreated, harried along the road back to Boston by farmers, firing from behind trees and stone walls. The mighty empire had bled and the colonies had tasted victory. Back in Boston, the harbor still carried the bitter memory of tea, but now it carried something greater, the certainty that rebellion had become revolution. From that first shot, mysterious, unclaimed, but undeniable, the world would change. Kings would tremble, nations would rise, and a new voice would thunder across the earth, declaring that liberty was worth any price. The night in Boston Harbor had been a spark. But here on the fields of Lexington and Concord, the fire had truly begun to burn. If this left you inspired, hit subscribe and join us on the front lines of history. Every day we bring you moments that shape the world. Raw, dramatic, unforgettable. Don't miss what's coming next.